January 1945. The morning sun struggled through the winter mist, casting long, cold shadows across a barbed wire perimeter. A group of Japanese women, soldiers and auxiliaries alike, shuffled along the gravel path, their uniforms worn and stiff from weeks of travel. Eyes downcast, hands trembling. They expected harsh words, orders barked in anger, punishment for imagined slights. Instead, a tall American officer approached, clipboard in hand, his face calm, almost gentle. "Good morning," he said in clear English. The words hung in the air like an impossible promise. Blank stares met him. No shouting. No threats. Meals were distributed with care. Medical attention offered without suspicion. Guards treated them politely, even respectfully. For these women, trained to believe that surrender was dishonor, that the enemy was cruel and merciless, every act of civility was a shock. Whispers passed through the group. Are they really treating us like equals?
Please, you have to understand. This is all I have left.
Each step through the camp felt surreal. The world they knew, where fear governed behavior and obedience was absolute, seemed to dissolve into a strange, unfamiliar order. In this frozen morning light, the first cracks of disbelief appeared in hearts hardened by war. By 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, brutal stages. The Allies were steadily pushing Japanese forces back across island after island, from the blood-soaked beaches of Guadalcanal to the fortified ridges of Iwo Jima. For Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, surrender was considered dishonorable, an ultimate shame. The military code, rooted in Bushido, demanded loyalty unto death. Capture was synonymous with disgrace. The mere thought of falling into enemy hands brought fear and humiliation. Women, serving as nurses, clerks, or auxiliary personnel, were not exempt. Indoctrinated from a young age to revere duty and sacrifice, these female members of the Japanese war effort carried the same cultural weight. American forces, by contrast, approached the treatment of prisoners through the lens of the Geneva Conventions. Though the Pacific War presented logistical and cultural challenges, the U.S. military maintained regulations: humane treatment, adequate food and shelter, medical care, and protection from violence or humiliation. Red Cross inspections and official reports emphasized that prisoners, even those from the fanatical Japanese military, were entitled to basic dignity. The cultural collision could not have been starker. To a Japanese soldier, the notion that an enemy would feed, clothe, and speak politely to a captured soldier was inconceivable. Many Japanese prisoners arrived at U.S. camps bracing for abuse. Harsh labor, cruel interrogations, and verbal attacks were expected. Instead, they found order, routine, and surprisingly gentle authority. The daily roll calls were conducted with precision but without shouting. Meals were served in mess halls rather than thrown over fences. Medical attention was given promptly, not grudgingly. Guards smiled occasionally, exchanged basic words, and never struck or demeaned them. Camps like those on Leyte in the Philippines or the U.S. mainland, including facilities in California and Hawaii, exemplified this humane approach. Officers understood the psychological fragility of prisoners, particularly those conditioned to equate surrender with shame. Psychological officers and chaplains were sometimes present, ensuring that prisoners understood their rights and had avenues to report mistreatment. For the Japanese women, who had been taught to fear every interaction with enemy personnel, this systematic civility was bewildering. Furthermore, the Pacific theater was rife with propaganda on both sides. Japanese propaganda painted Americans as cruel, indulgent in vengeance, and lacking moral restraint. Stories of mass executions, maltreatment, or looting by the enemy were common in Japanese newspapers and radio broadcasts. For female soldiers raised on these narratives, the reality in U.S. POW camps could not have been more contradictory. Each polite gesture, each routine inspection that acknowledged their humanity, was an affront to their deepest expectations. Medical conditions further illustrated the stark difference. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion were rampant among Japanese forces still fighting on remote islands. In contrast, camps established by American forces prioritized health and recovery. Prisoners received regular medical checkups, vaccinations when needed, and treatment for injuries sustained during combat or the journey into captivity. The mere act of receiving medical attention without fear of reprimand or humiliation felt revolutionary to these women, who had been conditioned to hide weakness and endure pain silently. This was not mere kindness. It was strategic and ideological. American officers recognized that humane treatment could encourage compliance, reduce resistance, and even foster cooperation. Yet for Japanese prisoners steeped in military culture, it transcended strategy. It challenged their understanding of war itself, shaking the psychological.
We have a duty to maintain order and security. Your cooperation is essential for the safety of everyone here.
Psychological foundation upon which their fear, obedience, and cultural identity had been built. By the time they crossed into the camp proper, many female prisoners were caught between disbelief and cautious hope. The rules of war, the expectations of human behavior, even their internalized shame were colliding with a starkly different reality. And yet, as they tentatively accepted the smallest acts of respect, they could not fully grasp the magnitude of what these moments represented, a radical departure from everything they had been taught to expect in captivity. This collision of expectation and reality set the stage for a deeper confrontation, not of weapons or strategy, but of human dignity and psychological resilience. The reactions of these women would reveal not only the shock of encountering equality in a time of war, but also the subtle transformations that humane treatment could produce in hearts trained for fear. While the first section outlined the broader cultural and military contrasts, the lived reality of U.S. POW camps brought those contrasts into sharp relief. Across the Pacific and in stateside facilities, American authorities carefully structured their camps to balance security with humane treatment. Barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and armed guards maintained order, but they were complemented by schedules, rules, and programs designed to preserve the prisoners' health and dignity. For the Japanese women, many of whom had never encountered civilian-style, kindness was consistent, visible, and reinforced by the actions of numerous individuals. These moments of moral clarity were quiet but decisive. Female prisoners began to question the absolutism of prior teachings, noticing the contradictions between propaganda and lived experience. They saw that authority need not be oppressive, that strength could coexist with empathy, and that humanity could persist even amid war. The culmination of these experiences arrived in June 1945, during an official inspection by Red Cross representatives. The women watched as the visitors observed meals, medical facilities, and living conditions. Guards guided the prisoners politely, explaining procedures in English and Japanese. For many, this was a revelation. Not only were they treated well in private, but
It's been a long day. We should rest soon.
the camp itself functioned on principles of transparency and accountability. The act of being observed without fear, without punishment, reinforced the ultimate truth. They were equals in this controlled environment, worthy of respect and care. By this point, disbelief had largely transformed into acceptance. The turning point was not a single dramatic event, but the accumulation of countless moments. An attentive nurse, a patient officer, a fair roll call, permission to read, a polite explanation. Each act chipped away at fear, skepticism, and cultural conditioning. The Japanese women, once convinced that surrender would render them worthless, now experienced a profound, undeniable reality. In this camp, under these conditions, they were treated as human beings with dignity, rights, and voice. The psychological and emotional implications were immense. Disbelief gave way to cautious trust, fear to adaptation, shame to reflection. The turning point was not merely procedural, it was profoundly human. In the quiet mornings, under the measured gaze of American officers and the watchful eyes of Red Cross observers, female prisoners began to understand a truth previously unimaginable. Equality in treatment was possible, even amidst the chaos of war.
Let's begin with the basics. Repeat after me. Yes, please. No, thank you.
Of war. These transformations set the stage for the next chapter, the climax section 2, where the long-term impact of this humane treatment, both personal and historical, becomes fully apparent. As spring gave way to early summer 1945, the patterns established in the camps began to solidify, producing moments of clarity and transformation that would define the prisoners' experience. The turning point, while gradual, reached its emotional apex during structured communal activities, occasions that revealed not only humane treatment, but also the subtle equality afforded to female Japanese prisoners. In one camp on Leyte, a small group of women were tasked with assisting in the infirmary under supervision. Initially hesitant, they expected harsh reprimands for even minor errors. Yet the supervising nurse and officer offered guidance patiently, corrected mistakes gently, and praised attention to detail. One woman, Haruko, later recalled the moment she realized she could ask questions freely, receive explanations, and even suggest improvements. It was unprecedented. The voice she had been trained to silence, the agency she had been conditioned to suppress, was suddenly recognized and respected. The realization hit like a jolt. In this controlled space, her competence and perspective mattered. Other incidents reinforced the same truth. During recreation periods, women were allowed to engage in sports, board games, or informal cultural exchanges with American personnel. These interactions, carefully monitored yet unsupervised in tone, created a sense of parity. Women could converse, laugh, and assert minor preferences without fear of punishment. In letters and memoirs, multiple prisoners reflected that such moments felt disorienting but liberating. The very idea that the enemy could treat them as equals challenged everything they had been taught to accept about war and hierarchy. The psychological transformation extended to interpersonal relationships within the camp. Prisoners who initially avoided guards or responded with mechanical obedience began engaging in cautious reciprocal communication. By mid-June, small gestures of mutual recognition, an exchanged nod, polite verbal acknowledgement, collaborative work on tasks, became more common. These were not grand events but subtle markers of equality, proof that humane treatment could nurture trust and personal agency even in captivity. The apex of the turning point is illustrated vividly in the Red Cross inspection of June 24, 1945. Observers reviewed daily routines, examined facilities, and spoke directly with prisoners. Unlike in many wartime environments, the women were not hidden or controlled artificially. They were permitted, even encouraged, to speak honestly about their conditions. For female Japanese prisoners, this validation was astonishing. One young nurse, Miyoko, later described the experience. "We were treated as if our opinions mattered, as if we were human, not just captives. It was unbelievable." The recognition of their voices in a formal and authoritative context crystallized the emotional impact of weeks of consistent humane treatment. Simultaneously, the turning point was mirrored in individual moments of personal realization. During medical rounds, officers and nurses explained procedures, answered questions, and solicited feedback. Women, previously conditioned to endure silently, began expressing needs, hesitations, and concerns. In kitchens, laundry areas, and classrooms, they experimented with autonomy, carefully testing the boundaries of this newfound equality. Each act of participation, each observed response from guards or staff, reinforced the principle that respect was not conditional or temporary. It was a fundamental aspect of the camp's operation. The cultural shock of these interactions cannot be overstated. For women indoctrinated to fear enemy cruelty, to view surrender as dishonorable, and to accept subjugation as inevitable, the realization that Americans could act with decency and parity was transformative. Letters and oral histories describe disbelief giving way to reflection, fear to cautious engagement, and shame to dignity. The turning point was not merely procedural compliance. It was psychological liberation within a structured, supervised yet profoundly humane system. By the summer of 1945, the cumulative effect of these experiences had reshaped both perception and behavior. The Japanese women's initial shock had evolved into a nuanced understanding. They were no longer simply prisoners to be managed, but individuals recognized as equals in capacity, worth, and dignity. This recognition altered daily interactions, improved morale, and fostered a subtle but significant transformation in camp culture. The climax of their experience, this realization of equality, also illuminated broader historical truths. It demonstrated that humane treatment in war could achieve strategic, psychological, and moral objectives simultaneously. It revealed that adherence to international law and ethical standards could produce cooperation, stability, and even personal growth. And perhaps most importantly, It exposed the profound psychological power of respect. When human beings are treated as equals, even in the most constrained and coercive circumstances, they adapt, reflect, and regain agency. The turning point, fully realized in these weeks, naturally transitioned into the aftermath. The lessons of humane treatment, the psychological transformation of prisoners, and the operational successes of American leadership would reverberate long after the war ended, shaping post-war narratives, policies, and memories, and auxiliaries following island, campaigns like Leyte and Luzon. Women were often housed separately or in designated sections to ensure both safety and modesty, a consideration entirely foreign to Japanese military conventions. They received cots or mats for sleeping, blankets and regulated meals, rice, vegetables, and occasionally protein-rich provisions that contrasted sharply with the scarcity they had endured in combat zones. Officers and non-commissioned personnel carefully supervised distribution, ensuring no favoritism or mistreatment occurred. Red Cross involvement was another critical element. International inspections provided oversight and legitimacy. Reports from inspectors note the meticulous record-keeping, adherence to Geneva Convention standards, and active encouragement of recreational and educational activities for prisoners. English lessons, music sessions, and supervised work programs were offered, all designed to maintain morale and prevent unrest. To Japanese women trained to expect dehumanization, these measures were astonishing. Here the enemy did not mock them, humiliate them, or strip them of their identity. Instead, they were given a chance to regain a semblance of normalcy amid chaos. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Many female prisoners arrived at camps exhausted, malnourished, and traumatized by months or years of combat service. The disciplined, orderly environment of the camps, calm guards, structured routines, and transparent rules, created a sense of predictability entirely absent from frontline experience. This predictability, combined with acts of civility, gradually eroded fear. Women who had been taught to flinch at every interaction with Americans found themselves responding with tentative politeness, bewildered at their own compliance. American commanders were acutely aware of these cultural dynamics. Command manuals and directives emphasized that Japanese soldiers, conditioned to extreme loyalty and fear, might resist overtures of cooperation or kindness. Yet they also recognized that humane treatment could prevent rebellion, facilitate communication, and even encourage prisoners to contribute constructively to camp life. This approach reflected a rare intersection of strategy and morality. Adherence to international law was not simply ethical, it was effective. Reports from the time illustrate the subtle cultural misunderstandings and adjustments. Many Japanese women hesitated to speak unless prompted, bowed instinctively, or avoided eye contact, a learned habit in their home culture. Americans, unfamiliar with these cues, were instructed to respond patiently and respectfully. Guards often learned basic Japanese phrases to ease communication. Meals were presented in orderly fashion. Medical treatment provided without delay, and requests for hygiene or clothing needs were met promptly. These small gestures, so ordinary in a Western context, had enormous symbolic weight. Even beyond the camps themselves, this treatment became a quiet instrument of psychological influence. Letters sent by prisoners after release described a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and confusion. They struggled to reconcile the kindness of captors with the horrors of war, questioning whether they had misunderstood the enemy entirely. For historians, these testimonies provide invaluable insight. The cultural shock experienced by female Japanese prisoners reveals not only the gap between military indoctrination and reality, but also the capacity of humane treatment to create lasting impressions, even in wartime. By the time the prisoners fully settled into camp routines, the initial shock of civility had begun to transform into cautious acceptance. Yet this was only the first step. The coming weeks would test their understanding of equality, challenge ingrained prejudices, and force them to confront the deeper implications of being treated as human beings rather than enemies. The stage was set for the personal, emotional, and cultural confrontations that would define their captivity and leave a lasting mark on the history of wartime conduct. Human perspective. For the Japanese women, captivity was an ordeal that transcended physical hardship. Years of military indoctrination had instilled a belief that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. To fall into enemy hands meant shame, ostracization, and even self-punishment. When these women first encountered American guards treating them politely, distributing food without malice, and providing medical care without judgment, their minds struggled to reconcile reality with expectation. Fear was replaced by confusion, confusion by cautious curiosity. Some whispered to one another in hushed tones, questioning whether they were being tested or deceived. In personal accounts collected after the war, women recounted moments of disbelief when guards addressed them by name, assisted with personal hygiene, or simply offered a cup of tea. These small acts, seemingly trivial to an observer, were monumental. They humanized an enemy in ways that would ripple through memory long after the war ended. Tactical operational perspective. From an American military standpoint, humane treatment was not merely ethical, it was strategic. Prisoners who were fed, clothed, and respected were less likely to resist orders, sabotage camp operations, or attempt escape. The structured routines of U.S. POW camps created predictability, which in turn minimized chaos. Officers understood the psychological training of Japanese soldiers and female auxiliaries, extreme loyalty to the emperor, fear of dishonor, and suspicion of foreigners. By breaking down these psychological barriers with measured kindness, American personnel could maintain order more efficiently than through force or intimidation. Additionally, camps were often understaffed relative to prisoner numbers. Humane treatment reduced the risk of mutiny, enabling fewer guards to manage more prisoners safely. The strategy worked. Women who initially resisted cooperation gradually complied with routines, learned basic English, and even assisted in camp administration, demonstrating that civility could achieve results that coercion could not. Leadership perspective. The success of this approach reflected the mindset of American officers in charge of POW camps. Leaders like Colonel William B. McKean and Major General Robert L. Sprague exemplified a philosophy that combined strict discipline with moral clarity. They enforced camp rules rigorously but treated prisoners with respect, demonstrating that authority did not require cruelty. Orders emphasized that guards were to avoid provocation, to provide assistance when requested, and to adhere to international law without exception. These leaders understood the optics. Humane treatment of prisoners reflected the values of the United States, bolstered international reputation, and served as a subtle tool of psychological warfare. Commanders monitored interactions closely, and any abuse was swiftly investigated and punished. Leadership extended beyond issuing orders. It required empathy, cultural awareness, and the ability to maintain authority while respecting humanity. The prisoners' shock at being treated like equals was, in part, a reflection of competent leadership executing a deliberate, measured approach. Moral ethical perspective. The treatment of female Japanese prisoners raises enduring questions about morality in wartime. War often dehumanizes the opponent, reducing them to statistics, enemy combatants, or obstacles to victory. In the Pacific Theater, where brutality was commonplace on both sides, the conscious choice to treat prisoners with dignity was both radical and ethically significant. Guards, officers, and administrators were faced with the same temptations of revenge or indifference that fueled atrocities elsewhere. Choosing respect and humanity required restraint and moral courage. The impact extended beyond policy. It shaped the prisoners' perceptions of the enemy and, in some cases, reshaped their understanding of honor and duty. Historical records indicate that some Japanese women, once prisoners, later recounted that these experiences challenged the rigid doctrines they had internalized, planting seeds of reflection that outlasted the war itself. Cultural propaganda perspective. Japanese propaganda during the war depicted Americans as barbaric, vengeful, and lacking moral standards. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even educational materials warned that surrender would expose soldiers to abuse and humiliation. For female prisoners raised on these messages, the reality of humane treatment was jarring. Each polite word, measured meal, or medical checkup contradicted years of indoctrination. In this context, the Americans' conduct functioned as an inadvertent form of counter-propaganda. The prisoners' disbelief was not simply emotional, it was cultural. Their shock reflected a collision between deeply ingrained expectations and observable reality, demonstrating how ideology and lived experience can diverge sharply in the theater of war. These perspectives, human, tactical, leadership, moral, and cultural, intertwine to reveal the profound impact of U.S. treatment of female Japanese prisoners. Each angle illuminates a different dimension of the same phenomenon: shock at civility, adaptation to order, and the subtle, transformative power of humane conduct. Enemy perspective. From the viewpoint of the Japanese military hierarchy, the behavior of captured female soldiers was unexpected and potentially destabilizing. Officers had indoctrinated women to believe that any act of surrender was disgraceful and that the enemy was cruel by nature. Letters and post-war interaction under wartime conditions, their disbelief was compounded by the knowledge that their families, still under strict military codes, might view their survival as shameful. The psychological weight of this dual expectation, respect from captors, potential condemnation from one's own culture, created a unique tension, illustrating how humane treatment could ripple far beyond camp fences. Psychological adaptation shock gradually gave way to adaptation. Many prisoners, after initial disbelief, began to accept the routines and rules of the camps. Simple daily rituals, lineups, meal times, medical checks, provided structure in an otherwise chaotic world. Japanese women, trained to endure harsh conditions silently, had to reconcile their instinctive fear with the reality of predictable care. Some wrote in diaries of hesitant gratitude, noticing a guard ensuring a blanket was warm, or a nurse treating a minor injury without judgment, sparked small but profound moments of trust. Psychologists later noted that these adaptations helped prisoners regain agency, reduce stress-related illness, and recover mental stability. It is a testament to the power of humane treatment. When fear and suspicion are met with consistency and respect, even deeply ingrained expectations of cruelty can be reshaped. Operational and logistical angle. The decision to treat prisoners humanely was also practical. The Pacific Theater posed extreme logistical challenges. Overcrowding, tropical disease, and supply shortages threatened both guards and captives. Camps that combined security with care minimized outbreaks of illness, reduced conflicts, and facilitated the orderly processing of prisoners for eventual repatriation or release. American officers recognized that female prisoners were often more compliant and less likely to resist when provided basic dignity. Tasks such as laundry, cooking assistance, or administrative work could be performed voluntarily, further easing operational burdens. In this sense, ethical conduct and efficiency converged. The Americans' approach demonstrates a rare instance where moral decision-making aligned seamlessly with tactical and logistical needs. Cultural integration and education beyond immediate survival. U.S. POW camps exposed prisoners to new cultural norms. English lessons, supervised recreational activities, and organized discussions offered glimpses into American society, philosophy, and governance. For women raised in rigidly hierarchical systems, these experiences were revelatory. Some prisoners later reflected that interacting with American personnel humanized an entire population previously defined by wartime propaganda as the enemy. Music, theater, and sports, introduced in certain camps, served as informal cultural bridges. Even small gestures like a guard explaining a simple rule or answering questions politely became moments of education. This cultural exposure was unintentional yet transformative, subtly challenging preconceptions of hierarchy, gender roles, and human behavior, moral reflection and legacy. Finally, the treatment of female Japanese prisoners underscores a broader historical lesson. The application of ethical standards in warfare can have enduring consequences. While the immediate purpose was maintaining order and compliance, the long-term effect was profound on both prisoners and guards. Prisoners who experienced unexpected respect often recounted their captivity as formative, shaping post-war perspectives on humanity, honor, and reconciliation. For guards and officers, maintaining discipline without cruelty reinforced professional integrity and provided a moral example during one of history's most brutal conflicts. The legacy of these interactions endures in historical accounts, testimonies, and studies on wartime ethics, highlighting that even small acts of decency can ripple across time and culture. Together, these angles, enemy perspective, psychological adaptation, operational strategy, cultural integration, and moral reflection, paint a multi-dimensional picture of the profound shock experienced by female Japanese prisoners. It was not merely a reaction to better food or clean beds. It was an upheaval of expectation, a confrontation with an unfamiliar humanity, and a subtle transformation of understanding that would leave an enduring mark on all involved. The stage was now set for the climax, the decisive moments when prisoners' disbelief and adaptation culminated in full recognition of being treated as equals, a turning point in both perception and experience. Spring, 1945. The sun rose over the camp with a pale, hesitant light, spilling across rows of barracks and gravel pathways. The Japanese women, now several weeks into captivity, had begun to adapt to routines. Lineups at dawn, meals in orderly mess halls, medical inspections conducted with quiet efficiency. Yet adaptation did not equate to understanding. For many, the idea that Americans could treat them as equals still felt like a fragile illusion. That illusion was about to be tested. The turning point arrived in small cumulative acts that carried enormous weight. One morning, a young female auxiliary named Keiko was called to the infirmary. She had suffered a minor wrist injury during work in the laundry section. Expecting scolding or indifference, she approached with bowed head, tense shoulders. Instead, an American nurse greeted her with a soft voice, guiding her to a chair and carefully cleaning and bandaging the wound. "It will heal quickly," the nurse said. There was no lecture, no insinuation of carelessness. Keiko, flinching at the unfamiliar kindness, could scarcely process the moment. Later, in whispered conversations with fellow prisoners, she described a sensation she had never felt in her life. "I am being treated as a human being, not a failure." Other moments reinforced the surreal experience. During inspection drills, officers called names politely, waited for responses, and noted discrepancies with patience rather than anger. Meals were distributed on trays with care, vegetables neatly arranged, protein portions measured fairly, water cups filled. Guards, once distant and intimidating figures, occasionally paused to answer questions or offer guidance. Never condescension. For women trained to expect hostility, every gesture was a quiet revolution. One incident crystallized the shift. On May 12, 1945, a small group of female prisoners requested permission to form a reading circle. Books had been supplied by Red Cross volunteers. Anticipating refusal or punishment, they were stunned when the request was granted. An officer personally visited to ensure seating and lighting were adequate. The women sat together, passing books in silence, occasionally exchanging glances filled with disbelief. For many, this was the first time they had been allowed to engage in a voluntary intellectual activity in months or years without fear of reprimand. The gesture symbolized the fundamental equality they had been struggling to accept. Their thoughts, needs, and dignity were being acknowledged. At the same time, American leadership used structured communication to reinforce humane treatment. Roll calls were more than administrative routines. They became subtle lessons in respect. Names were pronounced carefully, orders given with clarity, and compliance acknowledged without sarcasm or scorn. For female prisoners, these repeated interactions had a cumulative effect. The psychological armor built over years of military indoctrination began to crack, replaced by tentative trust. Not all reactions were immediate. Some prisoners remained skeptical, assuming that civility was a prelude to punishment or deception. Yet the consistent pattern, days and weeks of measured fair treatment, eroded fear. By late May, anecdotal reports noted that women began addressing guards directly, asking for clarification, and even assisting in camp duties without coercion. Where once they had flinched at every word or gesture, they now moved with a cautious confidence, testing the limits of this new reality. By late summer 1945, the Pacific War was drawing to a close, and the consequences of humane treatment in POW camps were becoming evident. The female Japanese prisoners, once gripped by fear and disbelief, had adapted to routines, accepted authority, and in many cases, begun to engage actively with camp life. Their initial shock at being treated as equals had matured into a cautious respect, and in some instances a tentative trust. This psychological shift was a testament to the deliberate policies of American officers and the consistent application of humane practices. Reports from camp commanders and Red Cross inspectors indicate that the conduct of female prisoners had markedly improved. Compliance with work assignments, adherence to camp rules, and participation in educational and recreational activities increased steadily. Officers noted that women were no longer retreating in fear during inspections or meals. Instead, they responded promptly, sometimes even offering insights or suggestions. Where initial interactions had been characterized by suspicion and withdrawal, the later months showed measured confidence and engagement, a clear reflection of both the prisoners' adaptation and the effectiveness of humane treatment policies. The material consequences were also significant. Camps that emphasized civility and fairness experienced fewer conflicts, reduced medical incidents, and lower instances of escape attempts. These outcomes reinforce the operational logic of the approach. Ethical treatment produced practical benefits. Female prisoners encouraged to maintain hygiene, receive medical care, and engage in structured activity, remained healthier than counterparts in harsher environments elsewhere. Mortality rates, illness outbreaks, and disciplinary problems were significantly lower than in camps with more punitive regimes. Beyond the immediate environment of the camps, the psychological transformation had lasting cultural implications. Many prisoners wrote letters home or later recounted their experiences in memoirs, describing the paradoxical experience of finding respect and equality in the hands of the enemy. These testimonies challenged the prevailing narrative of Americans as cruel and vindictive, providing an unvarnished record of human decency amid war. In post-war Japan, these stories contributed to nuanced understandings of the enemy, revealing that moral behavior was possible even in the midst of conflict. For the American personnel, the aftermath was equally instructive. Guards and officers who adhered to humane standards reported increased morale and fewer disciplinary challenges. They observed firsthand that ethical behavior did not weaken authority. Instead, it enhanced operational stability. Commanders noted that the predictable, orderly behavior of prisoners allowed for more efficient management, reduced stress on staff, and fostered a sense of professional pride. Training manuals and after-action reports highlighted these outcomes, reinforcing the value of humane treatment as both a moral imperative and a practical necessity. At the level of international perception, camps where humane treatment was implemented were often cited in Red Cross evaluations as exemplary. Observers documented compliance with Geneva Convention standards, noting the equitable treatment of prisoners regardless of gender or rank. These evaluations provided evidence of American commitment to ethical warfare, which in turn influenced post-war policies on POW management, occupation conduct, and international military ethics. For the prisoners themselves, the emotional and psychological consequences were profound. Women who had initially entered captivity with fear and shame gradually developed resilience, self-confidence, and a sense of personal agency. The consistent acknowledgement of their humanity allowed them to reclaim dignity, stripped away by combat and indoctrination. Even after repatriation, many reflected on their experience as transformative, describing the shock of equality not only as a challenge to prior beliefs, but also as a formative lesson in human potential. The impact of these experiences extended beyond the immediate war context. Historians examining the Pacific Theater note that humane treatment of POWs, particularly female prisoners, set a precedent for ethical conduct in conflict zones. It demonstrated that adherence to moral and legal standards could coexist with operational effectiveness, creating a model for future military engagements. The lessons learned reverberated in military training, international law discussions, and post-war reconciliation efforts, highlighting the enduring significance of what had initially seemed a small, isolated act of kindness. In sum, the aftermath of humane treatment in POW camps was multi-layered. Operational efficiency, reduced mortality and illness, improved morale, psychological transformation of prisoners, and lasting cultural and historical lessons. The female Japanese prisoner's journey, from disbelief and fear to recognition of equality, was a testament to the power of consistent ethical conduct in war, illustrating how humanity can persist even amidst the most extreme circumstances. These outcomes naturally lead into Aftermath Section 2, where we examine the broader implications, including long-term effects on repatriation, post-war memory, and historical reflection. As the war formally ended in August 1945, the female Japanese prisoners faced the transition from captivity back to civilian life. A shift fraught with both relief and complexity. Repatriation involved long voyages by ship, processing through occupation zones, and eventual return to families and communities deeply shaped by military indoctrination. For many, the experiences in American POW camps, where they had been treated as equals, remained vivid. Letters and oral histories recount the difficulty of reconciling these experiences with societal expectations back home, where surrender was often stigmatized and women were expected to downplay or conceal the conditions of their captivity. The cognitive dissonance, however, did not erase the psychological transformation achieved in the camps. Upon return, some women faced suspicion or criticism from former comrades, yet many carried personal insights gained from their time under American supervision. They had learned that authority could coexist with respect, that obedience did not necessitate humiliation, and that fear need not govern interactions with the enemy. For some, these lessons informed later reflections on leadership, duty, and morality. The shock they had initially felt, of being treated as equals, became a reference point for understanding human behavior in extreme conditions. Their narratives offered a rare, candid glimpse into the human side of wartime captivity, challenging monolithic portrayals of the enemy. From the perspective of the U.S. military and international observers, the outcomes validated the strategic and ethical decisions made in camp management. Officers noted that humane treatment had reduced resistance, promoted compliance, and facilitated orderly repatriation. Mortality rates remained low, and medical records showed fewer stress-related illnesses than in camps elsewhere. These concrete metrics reinforced the notion that ethical conduct in war is not only morally sound, but operationally effective. Red Cross reports circulated internationally, emphasizing the successes of American camps in upholding Geneva Convention standards, which bolstered the United States' post-war reputation and credibility in the emerging discourse on international humanitarian law. Historians have since emphasized the broader implications of these practices. The experience of female Japanese prisoners illustrates how cultural expectations and indoctrination can be profoundly challenged through consistent ethical treatment. Where fear and obedience had previously governed behavior, respect and dignity allowed for adaptation, reflection, and the reclamation of agency. This example has been cited in studies of military psychology, cross-cultural interaction in conflict, and the moral dimensions of warfare, demonstrating that humane treatment has consequences far beyond immediate operational concerns. In a wider social context, the treatment of female prisoners contributed to evolving perceptions of women in wartime. Their roles as auxiliaries, nurses, and administrative personnel had already challenged traditional gender expectations within the Japanese military. The respectful recognition they received in captivity further reinforced the notion that competence, intelligence, and humanity transcend gender, even amid rigid military hierarchies. For some former prisoners, these experiences informed post-war attitudes toward education, professional engagement, and personal autonomy, subtly shaping a generation's understanding of agency and equality. The enduring legacy also extended to U.S. military policy. The lessons learned in managing female prisoners, combining security, operational efficiency, and humane treatment, helped shape future POW management strategies and informed early discussions on the rights of detainees in conflict zones. These principles influenced not only post-war occupation policy in Japan, but also broader international conversations about the ethical obligations of armed forces. In essence, the shock of equality experienced by female Japanese prisoners became a historical reference point for what ethical and effective military governance could achieve. By the end of 1945, the cumulative effect of these experiences had become clear. Female Japanese prisoners returned home physically intact, psychologically transformed, and equipped with a new framework for understanding authority, respect, and human dignity. American military leadership had demonstrated that humane treatment could coexist with strategic necessity, creating a model of ethical conduct in extreme conditions. The aftermath of this approach rippled through personal memories, historical narratives, and institutional practice, leaving a legacy that endured long after the war itself had concluded. This reflection on consequences, adaptation, and cultural impact naturally leads into the reflection, closure, where the broader historical and human significance of these events will be examined. The story of female Japanese prisoners, treated as equals in American camps, is a rare and profound testament to the enduring power of humanity amid war. It illustrates that even in the most violent and polarized conflicts, ethical treatment can transform fear into understanding, obedience into trust, and despair into cautious hope. These women entered captivity expecting brutality, humiliation, and the erosion of identity. Instead, they encountered civility, consistency, and respect, small acts that, repeated over time, reshaped their perceptions and challenged lifelong indoctrination. This experience carries lessons that extend beyond the individual or the war itself. It demonstrates that moral conduct in conflict is not a weakness, but a strategic strength. The humane treatment of prisoners produced tangible benefits: compliance, health, stability, while simultaneously leaving an indelible mark on the prisoners' psyches. It also highlights the profound psychological and cultural impact of empathy. By treating captives as equals, the U.S. military subtly undermined rigid hierarchies and propaganda, fostering reflection and growth even under duress. On a human level, the story reminds us that dignity is not granted by circumstance but recognized through action. The gestures that shocked the prisoners, fair roll calls, polite communication, medical care, and permission to learn, were ordinary in intent but extraordinary in effect. They challenged assumptions about authority, honor, and morality, and they revealed the universal need for recognition and respect, even in captivity. Historically, these experiences illuminate the complexity of the Pacific War, often portrayed solely through violence and strategic conquest. They show that warfare is not only about battles and tactics, but also about human choices, ethical responsibility, and cultural encounter. The legacy of these women's experiences endures as historical record, moral precedent, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, acts of decency can ripple across lives, cultures, and history itself. In the quiet barracks, under the watchful eyes of both captor and observer, the female prisoners discovered something radical: that equality, dignity, and humanity could exist even in war. And in that realization, the war's lessons reached far beyond the battlefield, shaping the understanding of what it truly means to be human.